Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Western Canon Challenge, where we are reading the entirety of the Western Literary Canon out loud. Today we are moving on to journal collection number 42, and this dates from the year 1851. Emerson will turn 48 this year. And as always, we start with an editorial biographical update, which I will read. In January, Mr. Emerson lectured in New England, and in the following month in the towns of western New York. In March, he gave a course of 6 lectures in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, the discomforts of reaching which city partly by a canal boat, sleeping on the floor, "in a wreath of legs," he told in a letter to his wife. See Cabot's Memoir, Volume 2, page 566. End note. Here follows a poem. Morning Thoughts. Sleep is like death, and after sleep the world seems new begun, its earnestness all clear and deep, its true solution won. White thoughts stand luminous and firm, like statues in the sun, refreshed from supersensuous founts, the soul to blotless vision mounts. William Allingham. In the heats of youth we defend the stoical thesis, faith without works, the Platonic plenum, etc., and scorn to degrade our life by the trivial measures of practice. Of course, in the cardinal instance of love, the crimes of love are to be expiated and purified away only by more love. The flame of love burning up all mortal taint, etc. But later we begin to see that some allowance and always more and more must be made to the poor Whiggish facts, that is to say, the carnage made in human relations, the breach of the order of society, and the stings of remorse from a false position in the actor, and the cruel false position given to the sufferer, together constitute such a mass of rancorous objection that nothing but a supernatural magnanimity and aplomb in the hero can confront or make any head against. And all this is nothing but an expounding from facts of an occult law which the strutting pagan intellect had not descried, but which is integral part of the theory, and which a Christian soul, to be sure, would have divined without aid of the offensive facts. Then follows an untranslated quotation from someone named Richelieu, which I don't know who that is. The quote-unquote sickly sentimentalism, the quote-unquote trashy sentimentalism, as it is now called, of keeping the 10 Commandments. These taunts upon sentimentalism, and higher law, and the like, which our senators use, are the screens of their cowardice. Tennyson's In Memoriam is the commonplaces of condolence among good Unitarians in the first week of mourning, the consummate skill of the versification of the sole merit. The book has the advantage that was Dr. Channing's fortune, that all the merit was appreciable. He is never a moment too high for his audience. But to demonstrate this mediocrity, I was forced to quote those moral sentences which make the fame of true bards, such as, "In whose pure sight all virtue doth succeed," of Wordsworth, "'Tis crown enough to virtue, still her own applause," of Ben Jonson, or, "It was for beauty that the world was made," and then to ask, now show me one such line in this book of Tennyson. Turner. The fact that the creator of beauty in English art, the man who has all his life been shedding luster and loveliness in profuse works of his industrious pencil, is a poor hunks sulking in a lonely house with his woman Jessica, a miser too, who never asked anybody to dine, and has made £300,000 by his works, is not a dead fact, but significant of the compensations of nature, significant that every old crooked curmudgeon has a soft place in his heart, and not without comfort too, that when one feels the drawbacks and disgraces and diseases of his temperament and activity, he recalls that still he too may not be useless or pestiferous if he steadily retires on his task of even a sad, crusty, churlish expiatory devotion to art and beauty like J. M. W. Turner. The principal thing that occurs now is the might of the law which makes slavery the single topic of conversation in this country. A great wrong is attempted to be done, and the money power is engaged to do it. But unhappily, because it is the criminal, the feeble force of conscience is found to set the whole world against it. Diamonds, I read, appear the same in a bowl of water as out of it, whilst glass loses its light. Education Drill. It is better to teach the child arithmetic and Latin grammar than geography or rhetoric or moral philosophy, because these first require an exactitude of performance in the pupil. Man the inventor. It is frivolous, of course, to fix pedantically the date of this or that invention. Rotation. What an excellent principle our favorite rule of rotation in office would be, if applied in industrial matters. You have been watchmaker long enough. Now it is my turn to make watches, and you can bake muffins. The carpenter is to make glass this year, and the glass blower staircases. The blacksmith is to cut me a coat, and the tailor to take charge of the machine shop. Mr. Benton has served an apprenticeship of 30 years to the Federal Senate, has learned the routine, has opened his views to a national scope, and must now retire to give place to Johnny Raw. The odious inequality must be borne. A superintendent at the mills must have $2,000 whilst the most industrious operative has only 400, because order and faculty are rare and costly. Why should not the wheels of the loom say, "See me, I whirl and buzz with 200 revolutions in a minute, whilst that great lazy water wheel down below there only turns 5 times. I will not go faster than he." I learned also that the valuations of Massachusetts, of Boston, of New York, are nowise reliable for direct comparison, as for example the saying that Boston could buy Maine and have $80 million left. Because the values of Boston are artificial values, the value of luxuries, furniture, books, pictures, inflated prices of land and house lots and houses, etc., whilst the value of Maine are primarily and necessarily, and therefore permanent under any state of society. This consideration of inflation goes into all farming value. The farmer gets 200, whilst the merchant gets $2,000. But the farmer's 200 is safer and is more likely to remain to him, so that the two sums turn out at last to be equivalent. I found when I had finished my new lecture that it was a very good house, only the architect had unfortunately omitted the stairs. If immortal, how rich the joy of that aspiring soul whose competitors find him higher than earthly hopes. If, "not to be," how like the bells of a fool the trump of fame. But what renders this idle? The spirit is framed for endless happiness in its origin, without one other object or pursuit, writes my antique Saint Sibyl. The Morning. Hear what the morning says, and believe that. The house is full of noise, and contradicts all that the morning hints. Worse, it distracts attention from what the morning beams on us all to the nonsense which the house chatters. But there is one good child in the house who furtively eyes from time to time the east through the window, and so keeps his mind steadily fixed on that which it speaks, and defends his ears from the rattle around him. Diamonds. Quote, "A lady in the reign of Queen Elizabeth would have as patiently digested a lie as the wearing of false stones or pendants of counterfeit pearl so common in our age." Thomas Fuller's Worthies, Volume 2, page 294. January 15th. Last night at the social circle it was urged that persons were much hurt who had failed to be elected, etc., and the committee of nomination, which brings one candidate out of all the list before the club, was thought most invidious, and much was said on the natural indignation which the rejected candidates feel at having a better man preferred to those who stood prior to him in time of application, etc., to which two conclusive answers seemed to arise. If, when a vacancy occurs, there be several names, and the first in order of time is a blameless candidate, but young and nowise clubbable, and next below him is the man of a man who tells the best story in the county, and is as full of fun and information as Judge Warren, or Harry Lee, or the like excellent talker, is it not a cruel wrong to the club to deprive it, perhaps for years, of such a member? Then, secondly, I have no sympathy with the wounded feelings of candidates who wish to be preferred to a better man, or who count themselves injured when an older or better man is chosen. Let them sympathize with the club, and with good sense, instead of sympathizing with themselves. Say for a Boston club, J. Peter Leslie, Cabot, Ward, Lowell, H. James, Whipple, Hale, Curtis, Norton, Whittier. Low tone. Burns and Goethe and Carlyle, with great difference of power, understand it well. Goethe is in this way a great success. Aunt Mary and Henry James are proficients, and Charles Newcomb, Henry Thoreau, and Ellery Channing. Several pages which follow are printed in Culture, Conduct of Life, pages 157 to 158. Eloquence. Bad air, unfriendly audience, faint heart, and vacant thought in the orator are things, of course, and incident to Demosthenes, to Chatham, to Webster, as inevitably as to the gentleman who addresses the stifling Concord vestry this week. But here and there fell the bolt of genius, astounding and dazzling out of this very fog and stench, burned them all up, melted away bad air, rowdy mob, coldness, aversion, partisanship, sterility, in one blaze of wonder, sympathy, and delight, and the total consumption of all this fuel is the proof of eloquence. January 22nd. Mr. Rogers of Gloucester, who owns the rocking stone about half a mile from Gloucester village, which stone the tide moves, told me a story of Jarvis, of the Sandwich Glass Company, who came down there with his gun and bonded all the farms, the farmers thinking him a crazy man with a pocket full of money. So they followed him, and got each man $10 from him for a bond, and, last of all, his landlord also got a gold watch and $5. Then Jarvis went up to Boston, put himself in funds, came down, and demanded a deed of all these lands and houses, to the terror of the owners. To every reproach I know now but one answer, namely, to go again to my own work. But you neglect your relations. Yes, too true, then I will work the harder. But you have no genius. Yes, then I will work the harder. But you have no virtues. Yes, then I will work the harder. But you have detached yourself and acquired the aversion of all decent people. You must regain some position and relation. Yes, I will work harder. Columbus wrote to the king and queen, The men with me were 150, many fit for pilots and good sailors, but none of them can explain whither I went. I started from a point above the port of Brazil, storms. I put into an island called Isla de las Bocas, and then steered for terra firma, but impossible to give correct account because of currents. I ascertained, however, by compass and by observation that I moved parallel with the coast of terra firma. No one could tell under what part of the heavens we were, nor at what period I bent my course for the island of Hispaniola. The pilots thought we had come to the island of St. John, whereas it was the land of Mango, 400 leagues to the westward of where they said. Let them answer and say if they know where Veragua is situated. I assert that they can give no other account than that they went to lands where there was an abundance of gold. This they can certify, but they do not know the way to return thither for such a purpose. They would be obliged to go on a voyage of discovery as much as if they had never been there before. There is a mode of reckoning, derived from astronomy, which is sure and safe, and a sufficient guide to any who understands it. This resembles a prophetic vision. H. Major, page 191. February 12th. I must try to recall here, where I sit by the edge of Seneca Lake, my conversation yesterday with Albert H. Tracy of Buffalo. He believed that Europe was a feat beside America, and fancied that the office of men here was in many ages to bring the material world into subserviency to the moral, and that if one should expect only such a future as the past, nations and men might well despair, nor that yet were even the means of change apparent, and that it was utterly futile to hope anything from such arrangements or philanthropies as might now organize. For they begin by saying, "Now let us make a compact," which is a solecism, inasmuch as it implies a sentimental resistance to the gravities and tendencies which will steadily, by little and little, pull over your air castle. There is nothing to tie to it. He believes in a future of great equalities, but all our experience, he sees, is of inequalities. Some persons are thrown off their balance when in society. Others are thrown onto balance. The excitement of company and observation of other characters correct their biases. Margaret Fuller always appeared to unexpected advantage in conversation with a circle of persons with more common sense and sanity than any other, though her habitual vision was through colored lenses. Mr. Moseley at Buffalo described Webster's attitude when in the Senate seeking for a word that did not come. Quote, "He pauses, puts his hand to his brow. You think that then there was a mote in his eye. Still it comes not. Then he puts his hands, American fashion, first into his breast under his waistcoat, deeper than I can, then to the bottom of his fobs, bends forward, then the word is bound to come. He throws back his head, and out it comes with a leap, and I promise you it has its full effect on the Senate." The country boys and men have in their mind the getting a knowledge of the world as a thing of main importance. The New Hampshire man in the cars said that somebody grew up at home and his father whipped him for several years. He would fall on him in the field and beat him as if he would his cattle. But one day the boy faced him and held his hands. Then the boy had never been to school, and he thought he would go to California. There he was, a man grown, good, stout, well-looking fellow, 6 feet, but as ignorant as a horse. He had never had any chance. How could he know anything? So he went to California and stayed there a year, and has come back. He looks well, he has much improved in his appearance, but he has not got a ninepence. And really New Hampshire and Vermont look on California and railroads as formerly they did on a peddling trip to Virginia, as their education, as giving them a chance to know something. Nothing can be more foolish than this reproach which goes from nation to nation of the love of dollars. It is like oxen taxing each other with eating grass, or a society of borers in an oak tree accusing one another of eating wood, or in a great society of cheese mites, if one should begin making insinuations that the other was eating cheese. And yet there stand the two creations of Greek sculpture and of Italian painting. Women carry sail and men rudders. Women look very grave sometimes and affect to steer, but their pretended rudder is only a masked sail. The rudder of the rudder is not there. The poet ends a copy of his verses to the printer. Thenceforward he is relieved, the human race takes charge of it, and it flies from land to land, from language to language. It happens that they are now in a new style, and he may be even forced, like Coleridge or like Campbell, to prove painfully that he wrote the verses. They have become so entirely the world's property that it is hard to prove that he had anything to do with them. But the poetaster of our poor little Molenchock, having made what he calls verses, goes about reading them to you and me and all who can be made to listen, begs them to befriend them, to quote them, to sign a certificate that they are verses, to subscribe to his book, to write it up, and, in short, devotes himself to the business of nurse or attendant to these poor rhymes, which, God knows, need all this backing, and will go to the devil in spite of it. Quote, "An epic of a poet who has taken great pains to get favorable notices of his work in public prints. Such notices, said Goethe, have appeared in various papers. But at last comes the hollow literary gazette, telling plainly what the poem is really worth, and thus all the compliments of the other papers are nullified. Eckermann, Vol.2, page 158. Genial heat, imagination. There is and must be a little air chamber, a sort of tiny bedlam in even the naturalist's or mathematician's brain who arrives at great results. They affect a sticking to facts. They repudiate all imagination and affection, as they would disown stealing. But Cuvier, Oken, Geoffroy, Saint Hilaire, Owen, Agassiz, Audubon must all have this spark of fanaticism for the generation of steam, and there must be that judicious tubing in their brain that is in the boiler of the locomotive, or wherever steam they must be swiftly generated. They all deny it, of course. Goethe had this air chamber so large that, like Pericles, he must wear a helmet to conceal the dreaded infirmity, but he never owned it. He even persuaded the people that it was the county jail. If you have never so much faculty of detail, without this explosive gas, it makes the Dr. Pritchards and Dr. Worcesters and Dr. Warrens, men that hold hard facts, Dr. Dryasdusts, the most tedious and dreaded of mankind. But add this fanaticism, and you have Buffons and Davies. Dr. Jackson's misfortune is that he has none, and, like his class, is imposed upon by the loud disclaimer of the fanatics, and takes Goethe at his word that his air-chamber is the county jail. Nothing so marks a man as bold imaginative expressions. Henry Thoreau promised to make as good sentences of that kind as anybody. Bettine is the most imaginative person in our day. The French call one class of malcontents with the present order of things, those who espouse the liberal side in respect to the poor, the slave, etc., but who do not propose a remedy, les stériles. Beauty. Quote, "For there is a language in looks and gestures, there is a fountain of joy and delight concealed deep in the physical structure, and its waters laugh to the eye of intellect, and reflect into the heart of those who behold it a sunniness and exhilaration greater than we derive from gazing on the summer sea." St. John, Volume 2, page 191. Among the 19 or 20 things which make the test questions at the Egyptian funeral is the question, how did he stand on the world? Tests. Quote, who now awaits in the antechamber, Johnson or Chesterfield? Examiner. Sickness and poverty test the heart of the witness. Bad times. We wake up with painful arguing, and after exploring a little to know the cause, find it is the odious news in each day's paper, the infamy that has fallen on Massachusetts, that clouds the daylight and takes away the comfort out of every hour. We shall never feel well again until that detestable law was nullified in Massachusetts, and until the government is assured that once for all it cannot and shall not be executed here. All I have and all I can do shall be given and done in opposition to the execution of the law. Mr. Hoare has never raised his head since Webster's speech in last March, and all the interim has really been a period of calamity to New England. That was a steep step downward. I had praised the tone and attitude of the country. My friends had mistrusted it. They say now it is no worse than it was before, only it is manifest and acted out. Well, I think that worse. It shows the access of so much courage in the bad, so much check of virtue, terror of virtue withdrawn. The tameness is shocking. I am sorry to say it, but New Hampshire has always been distinguished for the servility of its eminent men. Mr. Webster had resisted for a long time the habits of his compatriots. I mean no irony, and by adopting the spirited tone of Boston had recommended himself as much by his great talents to the people of Massachusetts. But blood is thicker than water. The deep servility of New Hampshire politics, which has marked all prominent statesmen from that district, with the great exception of Mr. Hale, has appeared late in life, and with all the more strength that had been resisted so long, and he has renounced, what must have cost him some perplexity, all the great passages of his past career on which his fame is built. His great speeches are his discourse at Plymouth denouncing slavery, his speech against Hayne and Southern aggression, his eulogy on Adams and Jefferson, a speech which he is known by and in which he stands by the fathers of the Revolution for the very resistance which he now denounces, and lastly his speeches and recent writings on Hungarian liberty. At this very moment his attitude assumed as Foreign Secretary in his letter to Mr. Hulselman is printed in all newspapers before the people in the most awkward contradiction to his own domestic position, precisely like that of the French president between French liberty and Roman tyranny, or like Hail Columbia when sung at a slave auction. I opened a paper today in which he pounds on the old strings in a letter to the Washington birthday feasters at New York. Liberty! Liberty! Foe, let Mr. Webster, for decency's sake, shut his lips once and forever on this word. The word liberty in the mouth of Mr. Webster sounds like the word love in the mouth of a courtesan. The fame of Everett is dear to me and to all his scholars, and I have watched with alarm his derelictions. Whenever his genius shone, it of course was in the instinct of freedom, but one of his scholars cannot but ask him whether there was no sincerity in all those apostrophes to freedom and adjurations of the dying Demosthenes. Was it all claptrap? And as to the name of New England societies, which Mr. Choate, Mr. Webster, and Mr. Foote, Mr. Clay, and Mr. Everett address, and are responded to with enthusiasm, it is all a disgusting obsequiousness. Their names are tarnished. What we have tried to call great is little, and the merely ethnographic fact remains that an immense external prosperity is possible with pure cowardice and hollowness in all the conspicuous official men. I cannot read longer with any comfort the local good news even, education in Massachusetts, art union, revival, and religion. The little fact comes out more plainly that you cannot rely on any man for the defense of truth who is not constitutionally of that side. Wolfe, however long his nails have been pared, however neatly he has been shaved and tailored and taught and tuned to say virtue and religion, cannot be relied on when it comes to a pinch. He will forget his morality and say morality means sucking blood. The man only can be trusted to defend humanity, and women are really the heart and sanctuary of our civilization. Mr. Choate, whose talent consists in a fine choice of words, which he can hang indiscriminately on any offender, has pushed the privilege of his profession so far as to ask, what would the Puritans of 1620 say to the trashy sentimentalism of modern reformers? And thus the stern old fathers of Massachusetts, who Mr. Choate knows would have died at the stake before soiling themselves with this damnation, are made to repudiate the trashy sentimentalism of the Ten Commandments. The joke is too impudent. The profession of the law has the old objection that it makes the practitioner callous and skeptical. The practice of defending criminals of all dyes of guilt, and holding them up with vehement protestations that they are injured but honest men, firm Christians, models of virtue, only a little imprudent, and open to practices of bad men. It is the need of Mr. Webster's position that he should have an opinion, that he should take a step in advance of everybody else, and make the strongest statement in America, that is vital to him. He cannot maintain himself otherwise. Mr. Webster has deliberately taken out of his name from all the files of honor in which he had enrolled it, from all association with liberal, virtuous, and philanthropic men, and read his recantation on his knees at Richmond and Charleston. He has gone over in an hour to the party of force, and now stands on the precise ground of the Metternichs, the Castlereaghs, and the Polignac's, without the excuse of hereditary bias and of ancient name and title which they had. He has undone all that he has spent his years in doing. He has discredited himself. He to talk of liberty, and to rate an Austrian. He would dragoon the Hungarians for all his fine words. I advise Kossuth, after his experience of Gorgi, not to trust Webster. He would in Austria truckle at the Czar as he does in America to the Carolinas, and hunt the Hungarians from the Sultan as he does the fugitives of Virginia from Massachusetts. He may bluster. It is his tactics. We shall make no more mistakes. He has taught us the ghastly meaning of liberty in his mouth. It is kidnapping and hunting to death men and women. It is making treason a matter of fine and imprisonment and armed intervention of the resistance of an immoral law. The very question of property, the house and land we occupy, have lost all their sunlight, and a man looks gloomily on his children and thinks, "What have I done that you should begin life in dishonor?" I may then add the Union. Nothing seems to me more bitterly futile than this bluster about the Union. A year ago we were all lovers and prizers of it. Before the passage of that law which Mr. Webster made his own, we indulged in all the dreams which foreign nations still cherish of American destiny. But in the new attitude in which we find ourselves, the degradation and personal dishonor which now rest like miasma on every house in Massachusetts, the sentiment is entirely changed. No man can look his neighbor in the face. We sneak about with the infamy of crime in the streets and cowardice in ourselves, and frankly, once for all, the Union is sunk, the flag is hateful, and will be hissed. The Union, oh yes, I prize that, the other things being equal. But what is the Union to a man self-condemned, with all sense of self-respect, and chance of fairer fame cut off, with the names of conscience and religion become bitter ironies, and liberty the ghastly nothing which Mr. Webster means by that word? The worst mischiefs that could follow from secession and new combination of the smallest fragments of the wreck were slight and medicable to the calamity your Union has brought us. Another year and a standing army, officered by Southern gentlemen, to protect the commissioners and to hunt the fugitives, will be illustrating the new suites of Union in Boston, Worcester, and Springfield. It did not appear, and it was incredible that the passage of the law would make the Union odious, but from the day it was attempted to be executed in Massachusetts, this result has appeared, that the Union is no longer desirable. Whose deed is that? One more consideration occurs: the mischief of a legal crime, the demoralization of the community. Each of these persons who touches it is contaminated. There has not been in our lifetime another moment when the public men were personally lowered by their political action. But here are gentlemen whose names stood as high as any, whose believed probity was the confidence and fortification of all, who by fear of public opinion, or by that dangerous ascendancy of Southern manners, have been drawn into the support of this nefarious business, and have of course changed the relations to men. We poor men in the country, who might have thought it an honor to shake hands with them, would now shrink from their touch, nor could they enter our humblest doors. Can the reputed wealth of Mr. E. restore his good name? Can Mr. Curtis reinstate himself? Or could Mr. Webster obtain now a vote in the state of Massachusetts for the poorest municipal office? Well, is not this a loss inevitable to a bad law? A law which no man can countenance, or abet the execution of, without loss of all self-respect, and forfeiting forever the name of a gentleman? We therefore beg you to stand so far the friends of yourselves and of poor well-meaning men, your constituents, as not to suffer them to be put in a position where they cannot do right without breaking your law, or keep the law without corrupting and dishonoring the community. The college, the churches, the schools, the very shops and factories are discredited. I am surprised that lawyers can be so blind as to suffer the law to be discredited. The fame of Webster ends in this nasty law. And as for Andover and Boston preachers, Dr. D. and Dr. S., who deduce kidnapping from their Bible, tell the poor, dear doctor, if this be Christianity, it is a religion of dead dogs. Let it never pollute the ears and hearts of noble children again. Oh, bring back then the age when valor was virtue, since what is called morality means nothing but pudding. Pardon the spleen of a professed hermit. Mr. Webster cannot choose but regret his loss. Tell him that those who make fame accuse him with one voice. Tell him that he who was their pride in the woods and mountains of New England is now their mortification. They never name him. They have taken his book of speeches from the shelf and put it in the stove, and all the fribble of the Daily Advertiser and of its model, the New York Journal of Commerce, will not quite compensate him. I have no fear that any roars of New York mobs will be able to drown this voice in Mr. Webster's ear. It can outwhisper all the salvos of their cannon. If it were Mr. Cass, it might be different, but Mr. Webster has the misfortune to know the voice of truth from the stupid hurrahs of New York. It will be his distinction to have changed in one day, by the most detestable law that was ever enacted by a civilized state, the fairest and most triumphant national escutcheon the sun ever shone upon, the free, the expanding, the hospitable, the irresistible America, home of the homeless and pregnant, with the blessing of the world into jail or barracoon for the slaves of a few thousand southern planters, and all the citizens of this hemisphere into kidnappers and drivers for the same. Is that a name will feed this hungry ambition? Quote, inconceivable levity of the public mind, in unbroken prosperity the cause. There are, or always were in each country, certain gentlemen to whom the honor and dignity of the community were confided, persons of elevated sentiments, relieved, perhaps, by fortune from the necessity of injurious application to arts of gain, and who used that leisure for the benefit of their fellow citizens in the study of elegant learning, the learning of liberty, and in their forwardness on all emergencies to lead with courage and magnanimity against any peril in the state. I look in vain for such a class among us, and that is the worst symptom in our affairs. There are persons of fortune enough, and men of breeding and of elegant learning, but they are the very leaders in vulgarity of the sentiment. I need call no names. The fact stares us in the face. They are full of sneers and derision, and their reading of Cicero and of Plato and of Tacitus has been drowned under the glossiness of feeding and the bad company they have kept. It is the want, perhaps, of a stern and high religious training, like the iron Calvinism which steeled their fathers 75 years ago. That though I find the names of old patriots still resident in Boston, it is only the present venerable Mr. Quincy who has renewed the hereditary honor of his name by scenting the tyranny in the gale. The others are all lapped in after dinner dreams, and are as obsequious to Mr. Webster as he is to the gentlemen of Richmond and Charleston. The want of loftiness of sentiment in the class of wealth and education in the university, too, is deplorable. I am sorry to say I predict too readily their feeling. They will not even understand the depth of my regret, and will find their own supercilious and foppish version. But I refer them back to their Cicero and Tacitus, and to their early resolutions. It was always reckoned, even in the rudest ages, the distinction of the gentleman, the oath of honor of the knight, to speak the truth to men of power, or to angry communities, and uphold the poor man against the rich oppressor. Will the educated people of Boston ask themselves whether they side with the oppressor or the oppressed? Yet I know no reason why a gentleman, who is, I take it, a natural formation, should not be true to his duties in Boston in 1850, as haughtily faithful and with as sovereign superiority to all hazards as his fathers had in 1770, or as Mr. Hampden or Mr. Eliot in London in 1650, or Arundel or Moore or Milton. I do not value any artificial enthusiasm of protest got up by individuals in corners, which, however vehement, tells for nothing on the public mind. That I look eagerly, and shall not have to look long for a spontaneous expression of the injured people, in fault of leaders, creating their own and shaking off from their back these degenerate and unworthy writers. I make no secret of my intention to keep them informed of the baseness of their accustomed leaders. It is well to quote Cicero and Tacitus when doing the deed of Chiffonich and of Buckingham. In the weakness of the Union, the law of 1793 was framed, and much may be said in palliation of it. It was a law affirming the existence of two states of civilization, or an intimate union between two countries, one civilized and Christian, and the other barbarous, where cannibalism was still permitted. and the law became, as it should, a dead letter. It was merely there in the statute book to soothe the dignity of the man-eaters, and we Northerners had, on our part, indemnified and secured ourselves against any occasional eccentricity of appetite in our confederates by our own interpretation, and by offsetting state law by state laws. It was and is penal here in Massachusetts for any sheriff or town or state officer to lend himself or his jail to the slave hunter, and it is also settled that any slave brought here by his master becomes free. All this was well. What Mr. Webster has now done is not only to reenact the old law, but to give it force which it never had before, or to bring down the free and Christian state of Massachusetts to the cannibal level. Now this conspiring to hold up a bad law and intimate correspondence of leading gentlemen mutually engaged to run to New York and to Cambridge, and dine in public on poor Washington's birthday, and the reading of the Riot Act, and of Washington's legacy, and obtaining the preaching of Rev. Dr. S. and D., seems for the moment successful, and I do not know but Mr. Fillmore and Mr. Webster and Everett flatter themselves that the difficult Massachusetts is somehow managed, and that they had really overestimated the traditionary rebellion of the town of Boston. Once for all, the best lie has this insuperable objection: they are always at the mercy of a truth speaker. It does very well as long as all the spectators agree to make believe with them, but the first unlucky boy that calls things by their names will ruin the cheat, unless they can coax the good Creator not to make any more men. This is the end of Part 1 of Emerson's Journal Collection number 42, dating from the year 1851, when the author was 48 years old. Thank you for listening.